The year was 1866, and Vermont's northern hills lay smothered beneath a heavy quilt of snow. The wind off the Green Mountains carried a sharp bite, the kind that found every gap in a man's coat and gnawed at his bones. The town of Eastbury sat quiet, its chimneys coughing pale threads of smoke into the colorless sky. The Whitcomb farm stood apart from the main road, a cluster of weathered buildings crouched low against the wind. The family's roots here went back 3 generations, but the land seemed older still, older than the boundary lines, older than the first settlers who cut it from the forest. Inside the farmhouse, an oppressive warmth clung to the air, thick with the scent of burning maple and something more acrid, the metallic tang of boiled birch bark, steeped for reasons no one spoke aloud. The eldest Whitcomb, Martha, sat by the fire, her eyes clouded but strangely aware. She had outlived her husband, her sons, and nearly all her peers. Some said she was past 90, others claimed older still. Her body was frail, but her voice, when she chose to use it, carried an unsettling weight. That January the sickness came, slow at first, a fever here, a cough there, but in a town this small, even whispers carried fast. The Eastbury doctor, Elias Pratt, visited the Whitcomb place twice in 1 week. The second time his face was pale and his eyes avoided Martha's. By the 3rd week, 2 neighboring farms had gone black with mourning drapes in the windows. Those who lived to speak of it described the illness not as influenza or pneumonia, but as something stranger. A fever that left the victims shivering even as their skin burned, and dreams so vivid they woke screaming. One night in the depth of that bitter winter, the Whitcombs gathered in their front room. The fire burned low. No one spoke. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls like a living thing. Then, with a but announcement, they rose, dressed in heavy coats, and fetched shovels from the barn. Martha followed, leaning on her granddaughter's arm, her breath clouding in the lantern light. The frozen ground would fight them, but they dug anyway. And from the dark woods beyond the fence line, a shape moved. Slow, deliberate, watching. Next, a sickness that does not kill, yet takes everything. The townsfolk of Eastbury were accustomed to winter sickness. It came every year with the cold, chest ailments, frostbite, even the occasional case of fever that took the young or the frail. But this winter's illness was different. It had no rhythm, no mercy. It did not pass from one to another in neat order. Instead, it seemed to choose. Those struck would wake one morning feeling slightly weak, their thoughts sluggish. By nightfall, they'd be racked with chills, teeth chattering, eyes wide with a fever's strange lucidity. Some remained like this for days, still speaking, still eating in small amounts, yet never sleeping. Others would slip into long stretches of silence, staring at corners as though something stood there. The Whitcombs were not untouched. First it was Silas Whitcomb's wife Lydia, who began to wander the house in the small hours, whispering to the shadows. Her hands worked an invisible thread, her fingertips trembling in the air as though she were mending something only she could see. Martha, the elder, did not fall ill. Instead, she watched. Her gaze lingered too long on Lydia, as if measuring her for something. No one dared to guess what. When Silas asked his grandmother what she thought of the sickness, she simply said, "It waits for the willing." By the 2nd week, 3 more in Eastbury were afflicted, all over the age of 70. None had yet died. That was the strangest part. The sick grew weaker, paler, their skin stretched over bones like parchment, but they clung to life with a stubbornness that frightened even the healthy. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Dr. Pratt arrived at the Whitcomb farm, his black bag heavy with tonics and poultices. He examined Lydia by lamplight, frowning at her steady pulse, her 2 bright eyes. When he left, Silas followed him to the porch. "What is it?" Silas demanded, his voice low so the women in Sir D would not hear. Pratt shook his head. "It's not a sickness I can name. It feels more like they're holding on to something they should have let go of." That night, Silas woke to find the front door wide open, snow swirling into the hall. Lydia stood barefoot in the yard, her thin nightgown glowing faintly in the moonlight. She was looking toward the woods, and in that same moment, deep in the shadows between the trees, a figure stepped back, too tall, too still to be just a trick of the light. Next, a funeral that was not a funeral. The ground that winter was hard as stone, yet the Whitcombs were seen in the yard at dawn, shovels in hand. Snow fell steadily, muting the scrape of metal against ice, the dull thud of frozen earth breaking. Neighbors watched from a distance, their faces half hidden in scarves, reluctant to approach. It was Lydia they expected to see carried out. She had worsened in the last 2 days, thin as a rail, her lips moving constantly in whispers no one could understand. Yet when the door finally opened, it was not Lydia who emerged. It was Eben Whitcomb, Silas's father. Eben had been sick for months with an ailment everyone assumed was consumption, though the doctor never said so outright. That morning, however, he was not dead. His eyes were open, his breath steamed in the cold. He did not struggle as Silas and 2 cousins led him toward the open pit. No prayers were said, no words at all. The family moved with grim purpose, their boots crunching in the snow. Eben's breath quickened as he neared the hole, his clouded eyes darting toward Martha, who stood at the edge. She gave a single nod. The neighbors, unsure what they were seeing, stepped closer, but as they did, a strange silence fell over the scene, not the ordinary hush of falling snow, but something heavier, as though the air itself was listening. Eben descended into the pit, or rather, was guided down by his sons. He lay back without resistance. The shovels moved again. Snow and dirt fell in slow rhythm. Someone finally called out, Mrs. Tull from the next farm over. "What are you doing? He's alive!" Martha turned her head slightly, her pale eyes finding Mrs. Tull across the yard. "Not for long," she said simply, her voice barely louder than the wind. The neighbors did not stay to watch the rest. Some stumbled back to their homes, muttering of madness, of sin. Others swore they'd heard Eben humming under the soil before. The last of the dirt covered him. By the time Dr. Pratt arrived that afternoon, the ground over the pit was smooth, a scattering of pine boughs laid neatly across it. He demanded to know why he hadn't been called, but Silas only shook his head. He asked for it, he said, and would say no more. That night, the Whitcomb lanterns burned late, and somewhere in the woods, a faint answering light glimmered, then went out. Next, the whispers from beneath the snow. The storm that followed Eben Whitcomb's burial smothered Eastbury in white silence. Drifts piled high against fences, and the woods took on an almost cathedral stillness. But for those who lived within sight of the Whitcomb farm, that silence was not complete. At night, when the wind dropped, there were sounds, soft, rhythmic, rising from the direction of the new mound. They were not the creaks of ice-laden branches, nor the muffled scurry of winter animals. These were words, muffled, garbled, but words nonetheless. Silas claimed not to hear them. Lydia, pale and thin as paper, sat by the window every evening, her head tilted toward the yard as though listening to some distant sermon. When asked, she would only say, "He's remembering." Martha alone moved about the house without glancing toward the grave. But one night, the youngest Whitcomb, a boy of 9 named Jonah, woke to find her standing in the kitchen doorway, facing the frozen yard. The lamp behind her cast her shadow long across the floor. Her lips were moving, though no sound came out. Jonah thought she was praying, until she stopped suddenly, as though someone outside had spoken back. Word of the whispers spread. Farmers began refusing to pass the Whitcomb land after sunset. Even in daylight, some claimed to hear a low murmur if they lingered too near the fence. Mrs. Tull swore she'd heard her own name spoken in Eben's voice, drawn out as if from a great depth. On the 5th night after the burial, the sounds grew clearer. Silas, half mad from worry and sleeplessness, took a lantern and stepped out into the yard. The snow gave beneath his boots with a crisp sigh. At the mound he crouched, pressing his ear to the icy crust. It was his father's voice, weak, halting, but certain. "It's warm here," Eben was saying. "It's not what we thought." Silas staggered back, his lantern swinging wildly, scattering light into the trees. For an instant he thought he saw movement in the shadows beyond the fence. Tall, thin shapes, standing too still for men. When he blinked, they were gone. He didn't tell the others what he'd heard, but from that night on, the family's shovels stayed close to the door, as though they knew they might need them again. And in Eastbury, people began locking their doors, not against thieves, but against the possibility that something might call their names from under the snow. Next, the second burial, and the first scream. The second burial came sooner than anyone expected. By late January, Lydia had stopped eating. She sat by the hearth, her eyes fixed on a knot in the floorboards, lips twitching as if forming silent words. At night she rose and paced the halls, pausing often at the door as though drawn toward the yard. Silas tried to keep her inside, but the sickness had its own pull. One dawn, after a night of ceaseless pacing, she told him in a voice both fevered and calm, "It's my turn." Snow still fell when they carried her outside. Jonah followed, clutching his grandmother Martha's hand, his breath puffing in frantic clouds. The pit had been dug the night before, a dark wound in the frozen yard. The neighbors were nowhere to be seen this time, whether out of fear or grim acceptance, no one knew. Lydia stepped down into the hole herself, her bare feet leaving pale prints on the packed snow at the bottom. She lay back, folding her hands over her chest. Her breath was visible, slow and steady. Martha bent low, whispering something into Lydia's ear. Silas could not hear the words. Lydia smiled faintly, eyes closing. The shovels moved. Snow, then dirt, fell in a steady rhythm. It was not until the final layer began to cover her face that the sound came. A sudden, sharp scream, slicing through the cold air like a blade. It was not the cry of someone being buried alive in panic, but something deeper, stranger, as though she'd just seen something in the darkness below and could not bear it. The men froze mid-motion. Martha barked at them to keep going. "It's begun," she said, and there was a strange satisfaction in her tone. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by silence. The rest of the dirt went in. The mound was smoothed, pine boughs laid. That night, Silas awoke to a sound that was not the wind. It was a low, resonant hum rising from beneath the ground outside his window. He could not place the melody, but it was oddly familiar, like a hymn his mother used to hum when she thought no one was listening. He lay awake until dawn, heart pounding. In the pale morning light he saw tracks in the snow that led from the mound to the edge of the woods, long, narrow footprints set too far apart to belong to any human, and they did not return. Next, the old map hidden in the Whitcomb Bible. The Whitcomb Bible had been in the family since before the Revolution, its leather cover cracked and flaking, its pages yellowed and fragile. It sat on the mantel most days, untouched except for Sunday readings. But one grey afternoon, while Jonah was dusting the parlour, the heavy book slipped from his small hands and fell open on the floor. Between the brittle pages of Psalms lay a folded sheet of parchment, dry and brittle, marked with faint brown ink. At first glance it seemed nothing more than a crude map, lines for streams, shaded mounds for hills, and a scatter of small squares that might have been houses. But the details didn't match Eastbury as Jonah knew it. The streams curved differently, the hills rose where there were now pastures, and there were no roads. One mark caught his attention, a single deliberate cross drawn deep in the ink, in the very spot where the Whitcomb farm now stood. Around it, in a shaky hand, was written a word he did not recognize, Yarthmore. When Silas returned from the barn, Jonah showed him. His father's face tightened as he took the parchment. Without a word, he folded it again and tucked it back into the Bible. "Don't speak of this to your grandmother," he said. But Martha had already entered the room. Her gaze fell on the Bible, and the smallest curl of a smile touched her mouth. "You found it then," she said. "Good. It means you're ready to understand why things must be done this way." That night, after Jonah had been sent to bed, the murmur of adult voices drifted up from the kitchen. He could not make out every word, but he heard enough. "Older than the township. Buried here before there was a church. The ground remembers." Unable to sleep, He crept to the window. The moonlight shone on the mounds in the yard, turning them pale as bone. And beyond, at the edge of the woods, a faint, wavering light glimmered. The same kin Silas had seen after Eben's burial. It pulsed once, twice, and then was gone. Jonah pressed his ear to the cold glass. From far away, or perhaps from directly beneath the ground, came the sound of a slow, deliberate knocking, 3 times, then silence. When he turned from the window, Martha was standing in the doorway of his room. "If you hear them call," she said softly, "never answer from inside the house." Next, the first thaw, and what rose with it. February broke the back of the winter with a slow, reluctant thaw. The snow softened first at the edges of fence posts, then in the shallow dips of the yard where the sun lingered longest. Streams that had been silent for months began to murmur again, their voices low and secretive. The thaw should have brought relief, but in Eastbury it only sharpened unease. The ground over the Whitcomb mounds began to sink in strange, uneven patterns, as though what lay beneath had shifted. Pine boughs, once neat and orderly, were scattered across the yard, their ends gnawed as if by some small animal, but no prints circled them. One afternoon, Silas went to check the lower pasture and noticed something that stopped him cold. A thin trickle of water ran from beneath Lydia's mound, dark against the melting snow. It was not the clear meltwater of winter's end. It was tinted the faintest shade of red. That night, Jonah swore he heard footsteps circling the house, slow, measured, crunching in the half-frozen ground. He peered through the curtain but saw nothing. The next morning, however, a series of marks had appeared in the mud just beyond the porch. They were not boot prints, nor the tracks of deer or fox. Each was a long, oval impression, as if something heavy had pressed down without toes or claws. The thaw deepened, and with it came the smell. It was not the expected sourness of decay, but something older, sharper, like turned earth mixed with iron and wet stone. It clung to the air around the mounds, and sometimes, when the wind shifted, drifted all the way to the road. On the 3rd night of the thaw, Silas woke to the creak of the barn door swinging in the wind. Lantern in hand, he crossed the yard, the mud sucking at his boots. Inside the barn, the livestock stood silent, their eyes rolling white in the lamplight. The cows faced the far wall, ears flat, as though something stood just beyond it. Then he heard it. A faint, rasping breath, slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the yard. He stepped outside, his lantern spilling light over the nearest mound. The earth there was split, a narrow fissure running from end to end. A thin wisp of steam escaped from it, curling into the night. Before he could move, a single pale hand, fingers long and thin, emerged from the crack, groping toward the open air. Next, the thing that wore Eben Whitcomb's face. Silas froze where he stood, the lantern trembling in his grasp. The pale hand pushed further through the fissure, its skin stretched too tight over the bones, nails darkened with earth. Then, slowly, it withdrew, followed by a head. The face that emerged was Eben Whitcomb's, or rather, it was close enough to make Silas's stomach turn. The eyes were wrong, glassy, too wide, glinting faintly in the lantern light like wet stones. The mouth hung slightly open, as if unused to the idea of speech. When it finally closed, the skin around it creased in a way Silas had never seen on his father's living face. "Silas," it said. The voice was soft but carried across the cold yard as though the air wanted him to hear it. It had Eben's tone, yet something deeper beneath, a resonance like a voice heard through the floorboards from another room. Silas stepped back, his boots sinking into the thawing ground. "You?" His throat locked around the words. The thing smiled, or at least stretched its lips in a parody of one. "It's warm below," it said, "and quiet. You should come." From the shadows beyond the mound, another shape shifted. Silas caught a glimpse of something tall, its shoulders narrow and unnaturally high, its limbs too long. It lingered just far enough into the dark that he could not see its face, if it had one. Eben, or the thing wearing him, began to rise from the grave, the wet soil pulling away in clumps from his clothing. That's when Martha's voice cracked through the night, sharp and commanding, "Back down!" The figure stopped, its head turned toward her, and for a heartbeat, the glassy eyes seemed almost human, recognition, sorrow, something unnameable. Then it lowered itself back into the mound without resistance, the earth closing over it with unnatural speed, as if drawn by an unseen hand. The fissure sealed. Martha crossed the yard without looking at Silas. She planted her cane in the softened earth and muttered something too low for him to catch. Only when she turned to go did she speak clearly. "It's not your father anymore," she said. "And if you see him again, don't answer." That night, Silas lay awake, the lantern burning until dawn. From the far edge of the yard came the faintest sound, a dragging breath, patient and steady, like something biding its time. Next, the Sunday sermon. The preacher refused to finish. The following Sunday, the townsfolk gathered in the small clapboard church at the crossroads. Outside, the thaw had left the roads slick with mud, but still they came, drawn less by faith perhaps than by the need to be among others, to measure their own unease against their neighbors. Reverend Amos Barrow was a lean man with a voice that usually carried clear and strong over the wooden pews. That morning, however, there was a tremor beneath it. He read from the book of Job, his eyes darting often toward the Whitcombs' row, where Martha sat straight-backed, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. Silas sat beside her, his jaw set, Jonah between them. It was halfway through the reading that it happened. Barrow's voice faltered, the words stalling mid-sentence. He stared down at the open Bible before him, but his eyes were not following the lines. Slowly, his head turned toward the church's single-side window. A few others turned as well. Through the glass, beyond the graveyard fence, the thawing ground shifted. It was not the slow settling of earth under snowmelt, but a ripple, like something moving just beneath the surface. Barrow's face went pale. He closed the Bible with a sharp snap, the sound startling in the hushed room. "That's enough for today," he said, his voice hoarse. "Go home. Lock your doors." Murmurs rose among the congregation, but no one dared to question him aloud. Martha, however, did not move, her gaze fixed on the window, unblinking. When the others began to file out, Jonah lingered behind, peering through the glass. The ripple had stopped, but in its place he saw something else, half buried, just where the earth met the melting snow. It was the crown of a head, hair matted with mud, unmoving. By the time Silas pulled him away, the spot was empty. Outside, the air was heavy with the smell of wet soil. The Whitcombs climbed into their wagon, Mart, her leaning closer to Silas. "It's not just here," she murmured. "The ground all around is waking." As they rode home, Jonah glanced back toward the churchyard. At the far edge, near the line of bare-limbed maples, something tall stood watching. It did not move. It did not need to. That night the preacher's house stayed dark, his shutters closed tight. Some said they heard knocking from beneath the church itself. Next, the knocking under the floorboards. The Whitcomb farmhouse was old, its timbers seasoned by nearly a century of winters. The floors creaked in familiar ways, each board with its own voice. But 3 nights after the sermon, a new sound joined the chorus, faint, deliberate knocks from beneath the planks. It began just after midnight. Jonah, curled in bed beneath a heavy quilt, felt the first vibration through the mattress frame. 3 knocks. Then silence. Minutes later, another set. 3 again. Evenly spaced, as though following a pattern. At first he thought it might be the shifting of ice under the house, but the sound grew clearer, sharper, as if knuckles were rapping against the underside of the wood. By the second night, Silas heard it too. He paced the downstairs rooms, lantern in hand, pressing his ear to the floor. The knocks moved as though following him. When he stepped into the kitchen, they retreated to the parlor. When he crossed back, they slid under the hall. Martha, however, seemed unsurprised. "They're asking to be let in," she said when Silas confronted her. "The thaw has loosened the ground, and they want what's still warm." Silas demanded to know what she meant, but Martha only turned back to the fire, her face illuminated in flickers. "You'll understand before the season's done." On the third night, the knocking became something more. Jonah woke to hear not just raps, but a dragging sound, fingertips or nails scraping along the underside of the boards. It moved toward his bed, stopped directly beneath him, and then there came a low whisper, too muffled to make out the words. Terrified, he scrambled into the hallway where Silas stood with an axe in one hand. The knocking was now all around them, echoing from beneath every room. It was as though the very foundation of the house was surrounded. Then came a single resonant pound, so hard it rattled the crockery in the cupboard. The sound, it seemed to rise from the earth itself, shaking dust from the rafters, and just as suddenly as it began, all was silent again. The Whitcombs did not sleep that night. They sat in the front room with the lanterns burning until dawn. Outside, in the pale light, fresh disturbances marked the thawing yard, long, deep impressions circling the house, unbroken, as if something had walked the perimeter all night without stopping. Next, the third burial, and the deal revealed. The third burial came without warning. It was Silas's uncle, Horace Whitcomb, who had seemed in good health only days before. He returned from mending fences in the upper pasture with a strange look in his eyes, distant, as though seeing something far beyond the hills. That night he refused supper, sitting instead at the kitchen table, murmuring to himself in a low, steady tone. By morning, he was gone from his bed. Jonah found him standing in the yard beside Lydia's mound, bareheaded despite the cold, his hands clasped as if in prayer. When Silas called his name, Horace turned slowly, his lips curved in a faint, almost relieved smile. "It's my turn," he said. The family moved quickly, as if they'd known this was coming. Shovels were fetched. The pit was dug deeper than the others, the earth now soft enough to yield with only a few stubborn patches of frost. Horace stepped down without hesitation, lying back as if into a cradle. Before the first shovelful fell, Silas grabbed Martha's arm. "What are we doing? Why do they go willingly?" Martha's pale eyes fixed on his. "Because a debt is owed," she said. "This land wasn't given to us. It was spared. Long before there was a town, the people who lived here made a pact. The elders, when the earth called for them, would return to it alive. In exchange, the rest would live." Silas's breath caught. "And if we stop?" Her voice was cold and certain. "Then the ground takes what it wants, young and old alike." He looked at Horace, who met his gaze with an almost serene calm. "It's warmer than you think," his uncle murmured. The dirt began to fall. The mound rose. This time there were no screams, only the muffled sound of a man humming a slow, steady rhythm. 3 notes over and over until the sound was swallowed by the soil. That night the air in Eastbury was still, and for the first time in weeks no one reported sickness. The fires in the houses burned steady, the wind carried no whispers. But Jonah lay awake, thinking of what Martha had said. He imagined the earth beneath the farm, not empty but crowded, filled with the elders, their eyes open, breathing slowly, waiting. Somewhere in the dark, deep below, he thought he heard them hum. Next, the night the pact was broken. The breaking came quietly at first. It was Silas who decided it. 3 burials had already taken his blood, and he refused to let the earth have another. "We're not savages," he said to Jonah in the barn, his voice low but hot with anger. "We don't bury people alive anymore. Not for some superstition." Jonah wanted to agree, wanted to believe that this pact was nothing more than an old family myth clinging like ivy to the rotting beams of Eastbury. But he had seen too much. The stillness in the air after each burial, the way the sickness lifted as soon as the mound settled. He couldn't say the pact wasn't real. Silas, however, had made up his mind. When the next elder was called, old Mrs. Carrick, who had lived alone at the far edge of the pasture, he barred the door and refused to let the others take her. The rest of the Whitcomb family gathered outside her cabin, shovels in hand, faces pale but set. Martha stood among them, her white hair wild in the moonlight. "You'll kill us all," she told Silas, her voice like flint striking stone. "Or I'll save us," he shot back. For the first time since Jonah had arrived, the family turned their backs. They walked away without Mrs. Carrick, leaving her alive but trembling in her doorway. The night wind shifted. It was the first sign. A warm, damp breeze rolled in from the east, smelling of wet soil and rot. Jonah couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, listening to the timbers groan as though something pressed against the walls from outside. By dawn, the cattle were dead, all of them lying in the frost, eyes open, their bodies oddly unmarked. No tracks in the snow, no blood. Just stillness. Then came the sound from beneath the house. A slow, rhythmic thumping, like something knocking from below the floorboards. Jonah and Silas tore up one of the planks, but the space beneath was filled not with dirt, but with a thick black stone, like water that glistened like oil. The thumping was louder now, and Jonah realized it wasn't coming from the ground, it was coming from within the water itself. Martha appeared in the doorway. Her face was grey, her lips trembling. "You should have let her go," she whispered. That evening, Mrs. Carrick vanished. No sign of struggle, no trail, just gone. But the earth where her cabin had stood was sunk, as if it had swallowed her whole. And the wind did not stop. It blew all night, rattling the shutters, carrying with it a smell Jonah would never forget, wet, fresh-turned earth. Next, the thing that rose from the pasture. It began just after sunset. The wind had died, leaving a silence so complete that Jonah could hear the faint scrape of his own pulse in his ears. The family had gathered in the parlor, the shutters bolted, the lamps turned low. Martha sat in her chair, staring at the door as though willing it to hold. Then it came, a deep, wet pop, like a cork pulled from the throat of the earth. Jonah and Silas both turned toward the sound. It had come from the east pasture. A low mist was curling across the field, thick as wool, moving in slow spirals. The others stayed behind, but Jonah found himself walking toward it, his boots sinking in the soft soil. Silas followed a few paces back, muttering curses under his breath. They saw it at the same time. The ground had heaved upward into a low mound, the frost cracking and falling away from the rising swell of dirt. It was moving, not like something burrowing from beneath, but like the earth itself was breathing. Jonah crouched, staring. The smell hit him then, sickly sweet, like rotting flowers mixed with the iron tang of blood. Silas gagged. The mound split, not from digging, but from pressure. Something inside forcing the earth apart. The mist thickened, rolling outward in tendrils that clung to Jonah's boots like grasping hands. And then it came. At first, Jonah thought it was a root, thick, black, slick with mud. But roots didn't twitch, roots didn't pulse. It writhed upward, coiling like a snake, ending in something that almost resembled a hand. Not human, too long, too thin, with too many joints. Silas stumbled back, but Jonah couldn't move. The thing groped at the air as if searching for something, then stilled. Slowly, almost deliberately, it turned toward them. It didn't have eyes, yet Jonah felt it see him. The earth shuddered again, and more of it rose, a shape that might have once been a body if a body were made of bone, vine, and sinew, fused together by mud. It stood impossibly tall, the ground sinking under its weight. Silas hissed, "We have to go." But the thing took a step forward. The sound it made wasn't a growl or a cry, but the groan of shifting timbers, of old ships breaking apart in the deep. Jonah grabbed Silas's arm and they ran. Behind them, the creature did not give chase. It only stood there, watching or listening, its head tilted ever so slightly, as though memorizing the sound of their retreat. When they reached the house, Martha was waiting in the doorway, her face pale but unreadable. "It's begun," she said. Jonah realized then, this wasn't something new. The family had seen this before, and whatever had risen from the pasture tonight was only the first. Next, the family's oldest story, the one they never tell outsiders. After the thing in the pasture, no one spoke at supper. The only sounds were the scrape of cutlery and the faint hiss of the lantern. Jonah kept replaying the sight of that impossible mud-bound figure rising from the frost. When the plates were cleared, Martha told the others to leave the table, except Jonah. Silas hesitated but obeyed. Only when the kitchen door shut did she lean forward, her voice low. "You've seen what walks on the blood moon. Now you'll hear why it comes." She poured 2 cups of strong, bitter coffee, but neither of them drank. "It was 1796, she began, and the Caldwell name was almost ash. My grandfather was a poor man then, land near worthless, the soil too stubborn for wheat, too sour for corn. He'd buried 2 wives in the same winter. The last one left him no heirs. He had nothing left to bargain with, except himself." Her eyes went far away, as if she were seeing through the years. "They say he went into the swamp the night of a blood moon, carrying nothing but a spade and a flask of his own blood. He followed the sound of something singing under the water, said it was the most beautiful voice he'd ever heard. It led him to an island no map shows. And there, he made his bargain." Jonah swallowed hard. "With who?" Martha's gaze sharpened. "Not who. With what? Some call it the root mother. Some say it's the oldest thing in this land, older than the tribes, older than the forest. She promised him rich soil, unending harvests, cattle that would never starve. In return..." She trailed off. Jonah waited, the air between them heavy. In return, he swore that every child born under the blood moon on Caldwell land would be given to her before sunrise, buried in the earth while it was still warm. She would take them, and in their place she'd send her guardians. Jonah's stomach turned. "Guardians? Like the thing I saw?" Martha nodded slowly. "That way it's only one. There are more. Bound to the family, bound to the land. They keep our crops safe, drive away blight, even turn storms from our fields. But they're hungry, Jonah, and hunger makes them cruel." She finally took a sip of her coffee. Her hand was steady, but her voice was not. "My grandfather thought it a fair trade, and maybe it was at first, but every generation since has carried the debt. You think the town hates us because of greed? Because of some feud? No. They hate us because they know what we are, and because we've never once broken the pact." Jonah's mind raced through the strange silences of the family, the too rich earth, the absence of children in the blood moon years. Martha's gaze locked with his. "And now," she said, "it's your turn to keep it." Jonah lay awake in the loft, staring at the roof beams until his eyes ached. Every word Martha had spoken churned inside him. He could still see that mud-covered figure from the pasture, its wet hair hanging in ropes, its teeth like shards of bone. It hadn't just looked at him. It had known him. The thought of leaving seemed so simple. Saddle the mare, ride hard for the railway station, never look back. But Martha's voice echoed. "They keep our crops safe. They're bound to the land." Bound. He didn't understand the word until now. It wasn't just the guardians that were bound. It was the bloodline. He rolled over and glanced at the corner where Silas's cot lay empty. The boy was gone. Jonah crept down the ladder. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's listening. Through the frost-filmed window, he saw lantern light moving toward the far pasture. 2 figures, Martha and Silas, each carrying a spade. They were headed toward the old oak near the property line. Jonah's breath caught. He remembered Martha's words. Before sunrise, a sick understanding twisted in his gut. Somewhere out there, under the earth, the guardians were waiting for their offering. He pulled on his coat and slipped outside, the cold biting his skin like needles. The ground crunched underfoot as he followed them at a distance. The lantern light bobbed through the mist, slow and deliberate. They stopped at the oak. Jonah crept closer until he could hear the scrape of metal in the soil. He could see it now, a small bundle wrapped in white cloth lying on the ground beside the hole. It moved. The sound that came from it was barely human, thin, wavering, like a newborn's cry swallowed by the frost. Jonah's heart pounded. He could run. He could make it to the barn, grab the mare, and be gone before they noticed. But the thought of leaving that bundle behind, the thought of leaving it to whatever waited in the earth. Jonah. His head snapped around. Martha stood there, lantern in hand, her eyes catching the flame. She wasn't surprised to see him. "You've got to choose," she said softly. "You can run, or you can stay and see the end of it, and understand what keeps this place alive." Her voice wasn't pleading. It wasn't angry. It was tired. Behind her, Silas had stopped digging. He was watching Jonah, his face unreadable. The frost wind sighed through the grass. The bundle gave another faint cry. Somewhere deep beneath the soil, something shifted. Slow, patient, and impossibly large. Jonah's fingers tightened into fists. Jonah's boots crunched on the frozen grass as he stepped closer to the oak. The air around it felt heavier, as though the roots had grown fat on more than just rainwater. Martha knelt and brushed the frost from the white bundle. Her hands were gentle, almost reverent, but her eyes stayed fixed on Jonah. "This is how it's always been," she said, her voice low. "It will be how it is after we're gone." Jonah swallowed hard. "What is it?" Her gaze flicked toward the bundle. A promise kept. The cloth shifted, and a sound like a thin, wet breath slipped into the night. Jonah felt it in his spine. It wasn't just a child's cry. It was wrong. Too cold. Too empty. Like something that had never learned how to be alive, but was still trying. Silas's spade hit the dirt with a dull thud. The hole was shallow, no deeper than a man's arm. Beneath the loose soil, Jonah saw black roots coiling like veins, twitching ever so slightly, as though they sensed what was coming. Martha set the bundle beside the hole. The ground seemed to drink in its weight. The white cloth unfurled just enough for Jonah to glimpse a face, small, grey, eyes closed tight. No breath fogged the air near its lips, yet the faint sound continued, echoing from somewhere deeper. Jonah stepped forward. "You're burying it alive." Martha's eyes narrowed. "Alive is not the word. It doesn't belong here, Jonah. It never did. This way, it has a place, and in return, we have ours." The wind hissed through the branches overhead, and Jonah thought he saw shapes in the fog, low, crouching, moving with a fluid, jointless gait, watching, waiting. Silas placed the spade upright in the ground. "You gonna help, or you gonna run?" he asked quietly. Jonah's hands trembled. The choice clawed at him, turn away and live with the image burned in his mind forever, or stay and know exactly what kind of family he'd tied himself to. The earth below gave a faint, wet pop like a bubble bursting in thick mud. The roots shifted again, curling upward, tasting the air. Martha picked up the bundle and lowered it into the hole. The white cloth began to darken as soil tumbled over it. Jonah flinched at each shovelful. The muffled sound from inside the bundle didn't stop. It grew, softer, thinner, until it was gone. When the last of the soil was patted down, the air lightened, but not with relief. It felt like the deep breath of something old, satisfied. Martha turned, brushing her hands. "It's done, and we'll be safe through the winter." Jonah couldn't speak. He knew now, whatever grew here, whatever kept the frost from killing their fields, it came from under that oak. And it was fed. The fog thickened so suddenly it was like someone had exhaled over the entire grove. Jonah's lungs felt tight, the air damp and tasting faintly of copper. Then came the movement, slow, deliberate, out beyond the reach of Martha's lantern. Shapes pulled themselves free from the mist, tall at first, then folding, bending in unnatural ways until they hunched low to the ground. Jonah's first thought was wolves, but wolves didn't have limbs that bent backwards at the knee, and their heads weren't so thin, so elongated, with black skins stretched tight over the bone. One of them moved closer, each step silent despite the frozen grass. Its eyes were not eyes, just empty hollows, like sockets bored deep into its skull, yet Jonah felt them fix on him. Martha didn't flinch. She simply inclined her head, a gesture of respect, almost like greeting neighbors at Sunday service. "They've come to see the offering," she whispered. Jonah's pulse thudded in his ears. The creatures circled the oak in slow, ritual arcs, their movements synchronized as though guided by some unspoken rhythm. Each time they passed the fresh mound of earth, their heads dipped low, sniffing, not with a nose, but with a ripple in the air around their faces, like heat rising from stone. The largest one broke from the circle. It unfolded itself, stretching impossibly tall, and leaned toward Jonah. Its mouth opened, not in a scream or snarl, but in something that felt like silence made physical. The sound was the absence of sound, swallowing even the wind. Jonah staggered back. His ears rang, his vision tunneled. Martha's hand clamped down on his arm. "Don't run. If you run, they'll think you're trying to take it back." The creature leaned closer still, until Jonah could see the pale, spidery veins tracing its jaw. Its hollow sockets narrowed, and he felt it, not in his mind, but in his blood, cataloguing him, deciding whether he was friend, foe, or food. Then, as suddenly as it had approached, it withdrew. The circle reformed. They moved around the oak one last time, the mist swallowing their lower halves until it seemed they were melting into the earth itself. One by one, they sank down, their limbs folding inward until they slipped entirely beneath the soil, leaving only faint depressions in the frost where they'd been. Silence returned. Martha let go of Jonah's arm. "They keep us. They keep the cold from taking everything." Jonah's voice shook. "And in return?" Her eyes glinted in the lantern light. "In return, we give them what they ask for." The mist began to thin, but the cold didn't lift. It clung to Jonah's skin as though the creatures had left part of themselves behind, stitched into the night air. Martha's lantern swayed gently at her side as she turned back toward the path. "Best we get you home," she said, her tone casual, as though nothing unnatural had just passed through them. Jonah followed for a few steps, numb, before his legs locked in place. His breath came fast, his chest tight. Home? He thought of his bed, the fireplace, the wood-paneled walls, but then he pictured it empty, because now he knew. And knowledge like this didn't sit quietly in a man's mind. It hollowed you out. "You're not telling me everything," Jonah said, his voice low. Martha paused, glancing over her shoulder. "I've told you enough to keep you breathing, more than most ever here." "Why me?" His voice cracked. "Why bring me here at all?" "Because you saw something the others don't," she said. "The first time you came through town you looked. People don't look anymore. They keep their eyes low and their heads busy with their own small worlds. But you looked. And once you see the edges, you can't unsee them." Her words pressed in like the cold, suffocating and sharp. Jonah shook his head. "I'm not staying here. I'm not part of this." Martha's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes now, a quiet sadness, almost pity. "No one chooses to be part of this. But once you've stood in that grove, you belong to it." He backed away, his boots crunching in the frost. "No, I can leave, tonight." Martha didn't move toward him, but her voice followed, low and certain. "You can walk until your legs give out, but you'll still find the frost on your doorstep by morning. You'll still hear them in the walls when you close your eyes, and one night you'll wake to find you've been walking here in your sleep, with a lantern you don't remember lighting." Jonah's mouth was dry. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, to laugh, to call her a mad old woman, But the image rooted in his mind was too vivid. Him, barefoot in the snow, lantern swinging, led back to the grove like a moth to flame. He turned and walked away, faster with each step, until he was nearly running. The fog parted reluctantly, closing behind him like a curtain. When he finally stumbled through his own front door, heart pounding, the fire in the hearth had died. The air inside was colder than outside. On the table sat a single object, a small, frost-covered lantern. Jonah didn't sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the cold hearth, staring at the lantern on the table. Frost clung stubbornly to its glass, refusing to melt even in the warmth of his trembling hands. Every so often, he'd hear a faint clink, like glass tapping glass, but the sound didn't come from the lantern. It came from inside the walls. By morning, the frost had spread. It bloomed across the floorboards in delicate crystalline patterns, spirals, loops, shapes that almost looked like letters. He stepped over them carefully, but the ice seemed to follow his feet, reaching toward him like veins, searching for a heart. He left the house and tried to walk toward town. The snow was deeper than it had been yesterday. His breath came in ragged clouds. He passed no other travelers, no sound of chopping wood or barking dogs, just silence so absolute it made his ears ache. Halfway down the lane, he stopped. There were footprints in the snow ahead, bare, human footprints. They trailed off into the tree line, toward the grove. Jonah's stomach twisted. He didn't want to follow, but his feet began to move on their own, crunching into the snow, matching each print like a dance he had always known. When he reached the grove, the air felt thinner. His breaths were sharp knives in his chest. The frost-covered shapes from his floorboards were here too, winding across the ground, up the trees, curling around the stones like vines. And then he saw them. Not the white-eyed figures from before, but the people of Ashford Hollow. Men, women, and children stood silently in the grove, their bodies rigid, their skin pale as candle wax. Their eyes were open but unfocused, each holding a faint blue glow. Martha was among them. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She lifted one trembling hand and pointed at Jonah. The ground beneath his boots groaned. Frost shot upward, encasing his ankle. Crawling higher. He struggled, kicking, but the ice only tightened, burning cold. "You refused," a voice said. It came from everywhere at once, deep and layered, like hundreds of whispers pressed together. Jonah's breath shuddered. "I didn't agree to anything." "You came to the grove," the voice replied. "That was enough." The frost reached his chest now, locking his arms. His heartbeat slowed, each thud fainter than the last. His breath fogged the air in shorter and shorter bursts. The last thing he saw before the ice closed over his eyes was Martha's face. There was no pity left there, only acceptance, as if she knew this was how it always ended. And then the world went silent. Spring came late that year. When the thaw finally began, travelers passing through the valley noticed something strange about Ashford Hollow. The snow here did not melt like it did in the surrounding hills. It lingered in thick patches, glittering even under the harsh sun. The houses stood empty, their shutters banging softly in the wind. Frost crept along the eaves, tracing familiar spiral patterns. No birds sang, no dogs barked. One merchant swore he saw a figure in the doorway of the largest house, tall, gaunt, with eyes that glowed pale blue. But when he blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the frost patterns behind. The grove was worse. The trees there were petrified mid-bloom, each branch coated in an unmelting skin of ice. Beneath them the ground glittered with frost-laced stones, some worn flat, others jagged, as if they had been torn from deeper places. The stones bore strange markings, almost like letters, though no scholar could read them. Those who stayed too long in the grove claimed they heard faint whispers, not words exactly, more like the rhythm of voices speaking in a language you were never meant to understand. A few travelers swore they heard their own name among the murmurs. By summer, the frost still had not gone. Ashford Hollow was marked on maps as abandoned. The authorities boarded the main road, warning that the land was unstable due to ancient mining. The locals in the nearest town knew better. They would not speak of it, not even after too much ale. The few who ignored the warnings rarely came back. Those who did return were different. Their eyes seemed unfocused, their skin cold to the touch even in the heat of August. Some vanished weeks later, without struggle, without noise, just gone, leaving behind frost on their pillows and bare footprints leading toward the valley. And sometimes, on nights when the moon hung low and silver o'er the hills, people swore they could see pale shapes moving through the trees. They walked slowly, like sleepers following an invisible path. It is said that if you follow them, you will reach the grove, and if you reach the grove, you will see the frost patterns clearly for the first time, not as swirls, but as chains, each one linked to another, winding around names that have not yet been spoken aloud. If your name is there, they say, you will not live to see another spring. Ashford Hollow waits. It does not hunger. It does not tire. It remembers. And somewhere beneath the ice, Jonah still stands, eyes open, breath caught forever in a cloud that will never fade.